Rourke Castellano pushed open the door to the penthouse suite atop the Ambrose Hotel, loosening his tie after a night of negotiations that could decide the fate of his family's entire empire. In his world, a single slip could cost a man his life. He headed toward the bathroom to wash his face. The door was already cracked open. Strange, no one was allowed on this floor without his knowing. He pushed it wider, his hand drifting instinctively toward the gun at his hip. A woman lay curled on the marble floor, in a faded hotel cleaner's uniform, fast asleep as though she'd been drained down to the very last of her strength. Rourke's first thought was to call security. His second was that this could be a trap, but something made him stop. Maybe it was her worn-out shoes, nearly falling apart, or the exhaustion carved into her face, even in sleep. Then his eyes settled on her hands. She was clutching a creased old photograph and a child's asthma inhaler, gripping them so tightly her knuckles had gone white, as if they were the only things she had left in the world. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and when she realized where she was lying and which man stood before her, her face went from bewilderment to sheer terror in half a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so we know you're still listening. Don't forget to share this video with someone you believe needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the heartfelt stories we bring you every day. The woman sprang upright like a tightly wound coil, her back pressed hard against the cold stone wall, her hands still clutching the photograph and the medicine bottle against her chest as though she feared someone might tear them away from her. "Please, sir," she stammered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "Please don't call the police. Don't fire me. I'm begging you." Rourke didn't move. He remained standing in the bathroom doorway, his tall, powerful frame completely blocking the only way out, and there wasn't a trace of compassion in those cold blue eyes of his, as hard as steel. There was only the sharp scrutiny of a man who had spent his life learning how to see through every lie. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and measured, each word falling like a stone rolling down a mountainside. "How did you get onto this floor?" Adeline swallowed with difficulty, her throat painfully dry. "I'm a housekeeper," she said. "I was assigned to this floor. I have an access card. You can check it. I swear I haven't done anything wrong." Yet even as the words left her mouth, she could hear how meaningless they sounded, because no ordinary housekeeper would ever fall asleep on the bathroom floor of the most powerful man in the entire building. Rourke took one step toward her. Only a single step. But it was enough to make her feel as though the entire room had begun closing in around her. "No one is allowed onto this floor without my knowledge," he said, "and you're the first stranger in 3 years who has managed to do it." In his world, a stranger appearing on the very night he had returned from negotiations that would determine the fate of his entire empire could never be dismissed as coincidence, and he had survived far too long to believe in beautiful accidents. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. Adeline nodded slowly. Her gray eyes were brimming with tears, but she bit down hard on her lip and refused to let even one of them fall. "The whole city knows who you are," she whispered. "Then you should know I'm not a man who trusts easily," Rourke replied. At that exact moment, a figure appeared behind him in the living room doorway, a man dressed in a black suit, with a severe face and eyes utterly devoid of emotion. Silvio glanced at the woman cowering on the floor, and in his gaze she was nothing more than a problem that needed to be cleaned up neatly and efficiently. "Let me handle this," Silvio said softly, his voice so flat and calm that it sent a chill through the room. "You don't need to concern yourself. It'll only take a few minutes. No one will ever know she was here." Adeline didn't fully understand what those words meant, but she felt an icy shiver race down her spine, and she clutched the photograph even tighter, as though the child in the picture might somehow protect her. Rourke raised one hand. It was only a small gesture, but Silvio immediately fell silent and stepped back. "Not yet," Rourke said, never taking his eyes off the woman. There was something about her that made him unwilling to let the matter go, a piece that didn't fit into the picture, and his instincts had always been painfully alert to anything out of place. Someone planted here to harm him wouldn't have collapsed from sheer exhaustion. She wouldn't have worn shoes so badly torn that her toes showed through, and she certainly wouldn't have fallen asleep clutching a child's asthma medicine as though it were the last treasure she possessed in this world. "Wait outside," he told Silvio without turning around. His lieutenant hesitated for half a second, a hesitation Rourke should have paid closer attention to, then lowered his head and disappeared beyond the doorway. When the two of them were finally alone, Rourke pulled a chair closer and sat down across from her, resting his elbows on his knees and clasping his hands together. "Now," he said, his voice carrying less menace than before, though it still held no gentleness, "you're going to tell me the truth. The whole truth. Then I'll decide for myself whether I believe you. How long have you been here? What did you come here to do? And why is a woman like you so exhausted that she collapsed on someone else's floor? Adeline looked at him, then lowered her gaze to her trembling hands, and she understood that she no longer had the strength to build another lie. She had stayed awake for too long. She had forced herself to remain strong for too long. She had fought alone for far too long. And now, sitting before this powerful stranger, the hardened shell she wore every day was finally beginning to crack. I'll tell you, she said softly, but please promise me one thing. Whether you believe me or not, please don't do anything that could hurt the little girl. She's all I have. Rourke made no promise. He merely tilted his head slightly, signaling for her to continue. And Adeline understood that this was all she could ever expect from a man like him. She drew in a trembling breath and began, her voice quiet but steady, as though every word consumed the last remnants of strength still left within her. I work the day shift at a diner down the street, she said, from early morning until the sun goes down, serving tables, washing dishes, cleaning, doing whatever they're willing to pay me to do. Then, 3 weeks ago, I managed to get an additional job cleaning rooms on the night shift at this hotel because the VIP floor pays twice as much as the other floors, and I need every single dollar. She paused and ran her tongue over her dry, cracked lips. Tonight, I started my shift at 10 o'clock after spending the entire day on my feet at the diner. And before that, I stayed awake all night at the hospital yesterday. So by the time I came into this room to clean, I hadn't slept for nearly 2 days. I only meant to sit down and rest for a moment, she whispered, just for a little while. But I must have fallen asleep without realizing it. And when I woke up, you were standing there. Rourke remained silent, studying her with the intense attention of a man who had spent his entire life reading people, separating liars from those who spoke the truth, recognizing the difference between staged tears and an exhaustion that couldn't be imitated. And everything about this woman pointed to one truth. She wasn't the threat he had been trained to anticipate. She wasn't a blade someone had planted in the darkness to strike him. She was simply a human being who was drowning, struggling to reach the surface with the final breath left in her lungs. Her shoulders looked painfully thin beneath the loose uniform hanging from her frame. The shadows beneath her eyes were so deep that no amount of makeup could have concealed them. And her hands, roughened and calloused by years of labor, wouldn't stop trembling no matter how tightly she tried to hold them still. He had encountered countless desperate people throughout his life. He had watched men collapse beneath the crushing weight of debt and hopelessness. Yet there was something about her stubborn strength, about the way she kept her chin lifted even as her voice began to break, that kept him from remaining as indifferent as he should have been. You said you stayed awake all night at the hospital yesterday, Rourke said, and it wasn't a question. It was a single thread he had drawn from the tangled story she had told him, a thread he intended to follow all the way to its end. Adeline went still. Her gaze wavered for a fleeting moment before dropping to the small white medicine bottle resting in her palm. Her thumb moved unconsciously across the faded label, and her entire body seemed to fold inward around that tiny object. That's my private business, she said quietly, her voice suddenly guarded and sealed away, like a door that had just slammed shut. Rourke didn't miss the change. He had observed enough people to know that when someone who was exhausted and falling apart suddenly raised a wall of defense, it meant they had reached the most precious and painful part of themselves, the one thing they were willing to endure anything to protect. The bottle in her hand contained asthma medicine for a child. He had recognized it from the first moment he saw her curled up on the floor, and although he hadn't yet gotten a clear look at the old, crumpled photograph, he knew it held the face of someone she loved more than her own life. He could have forced her to speak. He had more than enough power and more than enough methods to extract any truth he wanted. But this time, for reasons he couldn't understand, he chose not to. He simply watched her for a long moment, this small woman clutching her secret as though she were holding a child against her heart. Then he rose, walked to the small cabinet nearby, poured a glass of water, and set it on the floor beside her. Drink, he said, his voice low and composed. You're about to faint. Adeline looked up at him in astonishment, as though she couldn't believe that an act of kindness could come from the same man who, only moments earlier, had blocked the doorway and stared at her with eyes as cold as ice. She accepted the glass with trembling hands, and in that moment, within this room whose luxury felt almost unbearably cold, something very small and fragile quietly shifted between two people who belonged to worlds separated by an immeasurable abyss. Adeline drained the glass of water, and perhaps it was that simple drink, or perhaps the unexpected kindness behind it that softened something inside her. Because when she placed the empty glass on the floor, she no longer hid the photograph against her chest. Instead, she slowly turned it outward, and her eyes softened in the way only genuine love could make them soften. "Her name is Posey," she said quietly, and her fingertip moved gently over the small face in the photograph as though she were touching the child herself. "She's 8 years old. People look at us and say she's my younger sister, and that's true, but to me, she's far more than a sister. I've raised her. I've cared for her. I've stayed awake through more nights than I can count because of her. So in my heart, she's my daughter, the child I never gave birth to but love more than my own life." Rourke sat down again in the chair across from her and said nothing, allowing his silence to become an invitation for her to continue. And Adeline did, her voice steady, though every word carried the crushing weight of an old pain. "My father died when I was little," she said. "It was an accident. It happened so quickly that I can't even clearly remember his face. After that, my mother had to carry everything alone. She worked as a nurse at the hospital, enduring endless shifts for barely enough pay. And yet somehow, she still managed to raise both of us. She taught me that no matter how poor we were, we had to remain decent people and keep our heads held high." She paused as her throat tightened. Then, 3 years ago, she became ill. It was a terrible disease, the kind where the longer the treatment continues, the higher the bills rise until they become a mountain. I sold everything that could be sold. I borrowed money everywhere I could. I got down on my knees and begged people to give me more time. But in the end, she still died. She left me behind. She left Posse behind. And she left a hospital debt so enormous that I don't dare imagine I could ever repay it in this lifetime. I was in my final year of nursing school when my mother became sick," she continued, and for the first time, her voice cracked slightly. "I only had a few months left before graduation, just a few more months, and I could have followed in her footsteps. I could have found a respectable job, but I had to abandon everything because I couldn't afford the tuition, because I had to work to support my sister, because Posy needed medicine, doctors, and a roof over her head. She has asthma," she said, her hand tightening around the small medicine bottle. "Whenever the weather changes, or whenever she pushes herself too hard, another attack comes. On nights like that, I carry her into the emergency room and sit there praying until morning. Then I wipe away my tears and go to my day shift, as though nothing ever happened. Last night was one of those nights," she whispered. "That's why I stayed awake all night at the hospital, and that's why I can't lose this job. Because if I lose it, how am I supposed to pay for her medicine? How am I supposed to keep her alive?" Then she lifted her head, and in those exhausted gray eyes, a hard, unwavering light suddenly appeared, a fierce pride that refused to break even after the entire world had pressed its weight upon her shoulders. The sight made Rourke pause. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice abruptly firm. "You pity me, and I don't need that, sir. I'm not telling you any of this to beg for your mercy. I'm not a beggar. I've never held out my hand and asked anyone for a single dollar without earning it through my own sweat. I don't need your pity," she repeated, each word falling like a stone. "I only need this job. I only need to keep working so that little girl can live. That's all." Rourke looked at the small woman huddled on his floor, a woman who had lost everything yet still refused to surrender her dignity, and something stirred inside his chest. Something he had believed had turned to stone long ago after so many years spent among cold-blooded men and ruthless schemes. He had met powerful men who were willing to fall to their knees for money. He had watched people sell their very souls in exchange for the smallest advantage. Yet sitting before him now was a woman who possessed nothing but a sick child and a crumpled photograph, and still, she rejected his pity with a pride that even his own powerful family might not have possessed. Rourke rose and walked toward the vast window overlooking the city, its lights glittering far below. He slipped both hands into his trouser pockets, and for a long while, he said nothing at all. He merely gazed into the darkness, as though weighing something he couldn't understand, something he couldn't explain even to himself, because he didn't know why he cared so much. Then he turned around. His blue eyes settled on her face, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, as though he were discussing an ordinary business matter. "How much do you owe?" Adeline looked up at him, bewildered. "I'll pay it off," he continued. "All of it, tomorrow. Give me the amount, and I'll take care of the rest. You'll never have to worry about it again." For one suspended moment, the entire room seemed to fall silent, and Adeline simply sat there staring at him. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Then she slowly shook her head, and when her voice finally came, it was quiet yet startlingly resolute. "No," she said. "Thank you, but no." Rourke frowned. It was a refusal he hadn't anticipated, because in his entire life, he had never met anyone who turned down his money, especially someone drowning in such profound desperation. "Do you understand what I've just offered you?" he asked, a faint edge entering his voice. "I'm talking about erasing the burden that has crushed your shoulders for the past 3 years with nothing more than a signature." "I understand," she replied, "and it's precisely because I understand that I'm refusing." She lifted her chin and met his gaze directly, her gray eyes refusing to retreat. "I know who you are, sir. This entire city knows who you are. And I also know that money from men like you is never given freely. No one gives anyone anything without expecting something in return, especially people with power like yours. And when a debt that large can be erased with a single signature, the price for it must be even more terrifying than the debt itself. I'd rather break my back, repaying every dollar with my own sweat until the day I die, than owe something to a man when I don't know when he'll come to collect, or what he'll demand in return." Rourke studied her, and instead of growing angry as he should have, the corner of his mouth lifted in something very close to respect. This small woman had just spoken aloud a truth very few people dared to say to his face, and she had said it with a cold clarity that forced him to see her differently. "You're wiser than you look," he said. "No," Adeline replied. "I've simply learned that lesson through my own blood and tears." Rourke remained silent for a moment, then pulled the chair closer and sat down again, this time nearer to her. When he spoke, his tone had changed. It was no longer the voice of a man bestowing charity from above, but the voice of someone making an offer he had considered carefully. "Very well," he said. "Then it won't be free money. I own an estate outside the city, a place that needs someone to manage it, maintain the house, and keep everything in proper order. It's a real job with a real salary, one far higher than what you're earning now by destroying yourself between 2 or 3 shifts. There's a residence on the property, large enough for both you and the little girl. More importantly, it's only a few minutes from an excellent hospital, one with a leading respiratory department, so whenever she has another attack, you won't have to carry her through the streets in the middle of the night searching for help." Adeline listened, and 2 powerful emotions began tearing at each other inside her. One was the burning desire to give Posy a decent home and a life that didn't always feel as though it might collapse beneath their feet. The other was the deep suspicion that had worked its way into her blood and bones after so many years of being betrayed by life. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you do this for someone whose name you don't even know?" Rourke didn't answer immediately, because the truth was that he didn't have an answer himself. He only knew that there was something about this woman that made it impossible for him to turn his back and walk away, as he had always done with anything that didn't concern him. "Consider it a matter of my needing a housekeeper I can trust," he said. "And trustworthy people are far rarer than you might imagine in my world." Adeline lowered her gaze to the photograph of Posy in her hand, her heart tangled in 100 conflicting thoughts. She didn't give him an answer right away. She only said quietly that she needed time to think, because she had learned that the most beautiful offers in the world were often the sweetest traps. But life had never granted Adeline the luxury of time to think, because only 2 days after that fateful night, when she had barely made it back to her cramped rented room after her shift, the elderly neighbor who watched Posy for her came rushing out, her face drained of color, saying that the little girl had suffered an attack that afternoon and that this one was worse than any before it. Adeline carried her through the rain and ran to the hospital in the darkness of night, and when the doctor emerged from the examination room with a stack of files in his hands, the look in his eyes told her the very thing she feared most. "Posy's condition is getting worse," he said gently, though he couldn't conceal the seriousness of it. "She needs a new treatment plan, better medication, and regular supervision from a respiratory specialist. Otherwise, every attack from now on will become more dangerous." Then he told her the amount, the cost of that new course of treatment, and Adeline stood motionless in the cold hospital corridor, her hand gripping the edge of a chair, because she knew exactly how much money remained in her account. She knew how long it would take her to save enough on her present wages, and she also knew that Posy didn't have that much time to wait. That night, sitting beside her sister's hospital bed, and watching the small face sleeping fitfully after the attack had finally eased, Adeline understood that her pride, the thing she had held around herself like armor for so many years, had now become a luxury she no longer had the right to keep. She thought about the offer made by the man at the hotel. She thought about the house on the estate grounds and the excellent hospital only a few minutes away. And she realized that she had been driven into a corner, that sometimes loving a child forced a person to swallow every doubt and every principle they had ever held. The following morning, she went to the Ambrose Hotel, and when she was escorted upstairs to meet Rourke, she stood before him with her back straight, her eyes still carrying their familiar strength even though she was crumbling completely inside. "I'll take the job," she said without hesitation, "but I want to make one thing clear. I'm not accepting because I trust you. I'm accepting because the little girl needs treatment, and I don't have another choice." Rourke nodded without showing any triumph, and simply listened in silence. "And I have one condition," Adeline continued, her voice becoming firm. "You may pay me for my work. You have the right to expect me to perform every duty within that work properly. But you're not allowed to ask about my past. What happened before belongs to me. Those wounds are mine, and I don't want anyone touching them, not even you." Rourke studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Agreed," he said. "I won't ask. In my world, everyone has things they wish to bury, and I'm the last man with any right to dig through another person's past." Adeline felt a little of the weight lift from her chest, and perhaps it was that relief that caused her guard to slip, because when Rourke asked a few questions about the debt so he could understand the situation she was facing, she accidentally mentioned the name she should have kept hidden. "My creditor is a man named Gareth Thorne," she said. "He's a loan shark. He bought my mother's hospital debt from the hospital, and since then, every month, he has sent men to remind me, using words that keep me awake at night." She didn't notice that the instant the name left her lips, something flickered across Rourke's face, a darkness, swift and deep, that passed through his cold blue eyes before disappearing in a fraction of a second. Gareth Thorne wasn't an unfamiliar name to him. He was the man who had spent the past several months quietly slipping into territories that had always belonged to the Castellano family, the man who was steadily expanding his reach and planting his influence in places no one should have dared to touch, the Thorne Rourke himself had been trying to tear out. And now, through a coincidence whose full meaning he couldn't yet understand, the enemy who moved through his shadows was the very man tightening his hands around the throat of the woman who had just stepped into his life. But Rourke revealed nothing. He only gave a slight nod, his voice still as calm as the surface of an undisturbed lake. "I understand," he said. "You take care of the little girl. Leave the rest to me." And Adeline, too exhausted and too relieved that she had finally found a way out, failed to recognize that beneath those quiet words, an entire storm was silently rising within the man standing before her. 3 days later, Adeline and Pazzi moved into the small house on the Castellano estate, a peaceful place, shaded by rows of towering trees and surrounded by sweeping green lawns that Pazzi had never even dared to dream of. That first afternoon, when Rourke crossed the courtyard to see whether his new housekeeper had settled in, he encountered something he had never once been prepared to face in all his life: a child. Posy was sitting on the front steps with sheets of paper covered in colorful scribbles scattered around her, and when she looked up and saw the tall man in a dark suit approaching, she didn't shrink away in fear as so many adults had done before him. Instead, she tilted her head with open curiosity and asked him innocently, "Who are you? Are you the owner of this place? You're really tall." Rourke stopped in the middle of the courtyard, and for one suspended moment, the man who could make even the hardest men bow their heads had no idea how to answer an 8-year-old child. "Yes, I live here," he said, his voice softening without his even realizing it. Pazzi nodded solemnly as though she understood, then held out a brightly colored drawing. "Look at the picture I made," she said proudly. "This is a house. It has a chimney and an apple tree, and this is Addie and me, and this is the cat I wish we could have." Rourke lowered his gaze to the drawing, to the clumsy lines of a child's hand, the crooked house, and the brilliant yellow sun glowing in the corner of the page, and something strange rose within his chest. A feeling he had forgotten long ago, from a time before his world had been stained by the coldness of power and calculation. "It's very beautiful," he said, and he was surprised to realize that he meant it. Pazzi broke into a wide grin, revealing the gap where one of her front teeth was missing, and began chattering about each of her drawings, about her small dreams and how she hoped to attend art school when she grew up. Rourke, a man who had never possessed enough patience to listen to anyone speak for more than a few sentences, remained there listening to a child, and the ice that had encased his heart for so many years quietly cracked along one fragile line. But then, In the middle of her story, Possy's voice suddenly faltered. She lifted a hand to her chest, her breathing grew labored, and a faint wheezing sound began to escape from her throat. Adeline wasn't there. She was inside the kitchen unpacking their belongings, and in that moment, Rourke was alone beside a child suffering an asthma attack. A man who had faced danger without so much as blinking suddenly felt his heart tighten, but he didn't panic. He immediately dropped to his knees so that he was level with her, his voice deep, calm, and steady like a rock, standing firm against the waves. "Where's your medicine?" he asked gently. "Look at me. Show me where you keep it." Trembling, Posse pointed toward the small bag resting on the steps, and Rourke immediately took out the familiar inhaler, the same one he had seen in Adeline's hand on that fateful night. He handed it to the child, keeping his voice even and reassuring. "All right, take a deep breath. I'm right here. You're going to be fine. Take it slowly. Breathe in, then breathe out. That's it. You're doing very well." He placed one large hand against her back and rubbed it gently, speaking to her in a calm voice that the men who had heard him issue orders would never have believed he possessed. Little by little, Posey's breathing eased. The wheezing gradually faded, and then disappeared entirely, and her small shoulders stopped trembling. When Adeline came rushing outside after hearing the commotion, she found Rourke kneeling beside her sister, and instead of crying, Posey was looking up at him with eyes shining with gratitude. "You're really good at this," the little girl whispered before smiling. "You saved me." Rourke rose to his feet, and when his gaze met Adeline's as she stood frozen in the doorway, he saw something in her eyes that he had never seen there before. It wasn't suspicion, it wasn't fear, it was a hesitant glimmer of gratitude, fragile as the first ray of sunlight after a long rain. And that night, Rourke, the man who had believed himself hardened against every stirring of the human heart, returned to his private room and found himself unable to sleep, because the gap-toothed laughter of a child and her innocent words, "You saved me," kept echoing through his mind, a sound that had quietly touched a place deep within him that he had believed dead for many years. In the days that followed, Adeline threw herself into her work with every ounce of devotion she possessed, as though determined to prove that she deserved every dollar she earned, that she had come there through the labor of her own hands rather than through anyone's pity. She rose before dawn, cleaned every corner of the house until it gleamed, and arranged everything with such care and precision that even the longtime servants couldn't help but respect her. She did it all with a quiet dignity, never asking questions about Rourke's private life, never entering areas where she wasn't permitted, and never revealing even the slightest intention of taking advantage of the kindness he had shown her and her sister. She kept her distance from him the way one keeps away from a flame, grateful for the warmth it offered, yet afraid to draw too close for fear of being burned. Posy, on the other hand, grew more attached to her new home with each passing day, running freely through the gardens, and her health improved visibly now that she was receiving proper treatment at the nearby hospital. Her asthma attacks became less frequent, and the cheeks that had once been so pale began to carry a faint flush of healthy color. Rourke, without knowing exactly when it had begun, started returning home earlier than usual. The man who had once regarded the estate as nothing more than a place to sleep between long nights of strategy and calculation now found himself looking forward to coming back, though he would never have admitted it, not even to himself. Then one night, when he returned later than usual and passed the library, he stopped beside the partially open door, because in the muted golden light spilling into the hallway, he saw Adeline seated at the desk, bent over an old, heavy book, her eyes moving intently across each line, even though she was clearly exhausted after a long day of work. He looked more closely and realized it was a medical textbook, the kind used by nursing students, its pages yellowed and curled at the edges from having been turned again and again countless times. In that moment, he understood. Her unfinished dream, the profession she had been forced to abandon in order to save her sister, had never truly gone out inside her. Night after night, once Posy was deeply asleep, Adeline quietly opened those old pages and returned to the lessons she had once left unfinished, keeping that small flame alive amid the endless demands of survival. Rourke stood there watching her for a long time, a strange feeling rising within him, part admiration and part of vague, aching sorrow, before he silently walked away so he wouldn't startle her. But not every night remained so peaceful. Not long afterward, late one evening, Adeline went searching for Posy after the little girl had wandered into the rear garden, and she happened to pass Rourke's private office, where the door had been left slightly ajar. From inside came the low murmur of several men's voices. She hadn't intended to listen. She only paused for a moment out of curiosity. And through the narrow opening, She saw Rourke standing with several men dressed in dark suits, every face tense. The words they exchanged were things she couldn't fully understand. Unfamiliar names, distant places, numbers, and something about powerful forces shifting through the shadows. Something she could only vaguely sense was dangerous. She heard Rourke's voice, deep and decisive, ordering the others to carry out some task, and in that moment, a chill passed through her as she realized that the man who had saved Pazzi and given the two sisters a home was also the man standing at the very center of a world she never wanted to touch. She quickly stepped back, intending to leave before anyone noticed her, but she wasn't fast enough. The instant she turned around, her eyes met another pair watching her intently from the far end of the darkened hallway, the cold, emotionless eyes of Silvio, the man who had wanted to deal with her on that first night at the hotel. He stood there in silence like a shadow, and he had seen everything. He had seen her standing outside the partially open door. He had seen her listening to things she was never supposed to hear. Adeline quickly lowered her head and hurried away, her heart pounding violently, but she didn't know that in Silvio's cold gaze, a poisonous seed had just been planted, and he would nurture it in a way she could never have imagined. Rourke had promised that he wouldn't ask Adeline about her past, and he was a man who always kept his word, but that promise couldn't stop, the curiosity steadily growing within him about the strange woman who had stepped into his life. And above all, it couldn't silence the instinct that had settled deep into his blood after so many years spent in a world where understanding a person completely could mean the difference between life and death. He didn't question her, but he had other ways of finding answers. One afternoon, while Adeline took Pazzi to the hospital for a follow-up examination, Rourke entered the small house where the two sisters lived, and on the old wooden table beside the bed, he saw the photograph, the same crumpled picture she had clutched so tightly on that fateful night, now resting inside a simple wooden frame. He picked it up, and for the first time, he studied it closely. In the photograph, Posey was younger than she was now, smiling beside a kind-looking middle-aged woman dressed in a pale blue nursing uniform, and behind them, blurred in the background, stood a hospital building that Rourke recognized immediately because it wasn't an ordinary hospital. It was the very place where, many years earlier, on one of the darkest nights of his life, he had sat in the corridor until morning, waiting in helpless despair. Something pierced his chest, a vague premonition he couldn't name, and that very evening, he ordered someone to quietly search through the old records, the yellowing documents buried deep within the archives of that hospital. What he discovered left him completely still. Many years ago, before he had become the powerful boss he was now, before his family had risen to its present heights, he had lost someone he loved, someone he had brought to that hospital too late, someone all the money and limited power he possessed at the time had been unable to save. He had always remembered those final hours as a scar that would never heal. He remembered that while he was drowning in grief and helplessness, a nurse had remained beside the bed, a gentle woman who hadn't left even after her shift had ended, who had held the dying person's hand and whispered words of comfort, who had cared for Rourke's loved one with such devotion that it was as though she were tending to a member of her own family. In the depths of his pain that night, he hadn't even thought to ask the kind woman's name, and through all the years that followed, he had carried within him a debt of gratitude he had never been able to repay. Now, as he followed the faded lines written in the old records, the name that appeared before his eyes made his heart, which he had believed long since turned to stone, strike hard against his chest, because the nurse from all those years ago, the woman who had remained beside his loved one during the final moments of life, was Adeline's mother. Rourke sat silently for a very long time in the darkness of his private office, the old file lying open on the desk before him, and it felt as though an invisible hand of fate had quietly guided every piece into its rightful place. The woman he had found by chance asleep on his bathroom floor, the woman he had reached out to help without understanding why he felt compelled to do so, was the daughter of the person who had once shown him mercy, the flesh and blood of the woman who had treated his loved one with kindness on the night when the entire world had seemed to turn its back on him. Helping Adeline, something he had believed was nothing more than an impulse he couldn't explain, now revealed itself as a debt written by fate, as though heaven itself had arranged for him to repay a small part of the kindness her mother had planted so many years before. But Rourke didn't tell Adeline what he had discovered, partly because he had promised not to dig into her past, and he knew that if she learned he had secretly investigated her life, the wall of suspicion between them would only grow thicker. But there was another reason, one buried far deeper. and it was that he wasn't ready for her to know that the kindness he had shown her wasn't entirely selfless, that behind it lay a debt, a past, and a wound he still didn't dare touch. And so he kept the secret to himself, burying it as deeply as he could, never realizing that some secrets, once concealed, have a way of rising again at the worst possible moment. Fate rarely allows secrets to rest undisturbed, and while Rourke was still silently carrying what he had just discovered, on the other side of the city, Gareth Thorne had also caught the scent of something that made it impossible for him to remain still. His men, the ones who had continued circling Adeline's former home month after month to remind her of the debt, reported that the woman had suddenly vanished, leaving the cramped rented room without a trace. It took Thorne some time to investigate, but eventually he uncovered a truth that left him both astonished and amused. His insignificant little debtor was now living under the protection of Rourke Castellano himself, the very enemy Thorne had been steadily working to bring down. To a scheming man like Thorne, this wasn't an obstacle but an opportunity delivered by fate, because he understood that in the world of powerful men, a fatal weakness wasn't found in guns or money, but in the things they began to care about, the things they couldn't bear to lose. And if Rourke Castellano, a man whose coldness was feared throughout the region, was willing to shelter an impoverished housekeeper and her sickly younger sister, then it could only mean that the woman had become something meaningful to him, and anything meaningful to an enemy was always a valuable piece on the board. A few days later, one morning, an envelope with no sender's name was left directly outside the gates of the Castellano estate and delivered into Rourke's hands by one of the guards, whose expression was filled with caution. Rourke opened it inside his private office, and within it was a single sheet of paper bearing only a few short lines typed in a cold, impersonal hand, with no greeting and no signature. The message referred to the debt under the name Adeline Vance, and warned that no matter where she hid or beneath whose powerful shadow she sought refuge, the debt still remained and would one day have to be paid. At the end, in a veiled and openly challenging tone, the writer suggested that it was amusing to see the Castellano lion concerning himself with an insignificant little mouse, and that perhaps it was time for people to reconsider whether that iron heart truly had no weakness after all. Rourke read the page again and again, and although his face remained as still as the surface of a frozen lake, deep within his cold blue eyes, a quiet flame had begun to burn. He recognized Thorne's hand immediately. This was how the man declared war, not through a direct attack, but through a carefully crafted provocation, a test designed to discover whether Adeline truly was Rourke's weakness. And what made Rourke clench his jaw wasn't the threat aimed at him, because he had spent his entire life surrounded by threats and had never once wavered, but the fact that Thorne had dared to drag Adeline's name, and through her, Pazzi's as well, into the ruthless game between two men. But Rourke was an experienced player, and he understood that reacting too quickly to a provocation was exactly what his enemy expected. If he rushed out to retaliate at once, he would only confirm with his own actions that the woman truly was his most vulnerable point. And so he chose silence. He chose to watch. He folded the letter, placed it inside a drawer, and locked his anger away behind a calm exterior. But silence didn't mean carelessness. That very night, Rourke quietly increased security around the estate. Guards were positioned more discreetly near the small house where the two sisters lived. Every unfamiliar vehicle passing near the gates was recorded and followed, and he instructed his men to keep a particularly close watch on Adeline and Pazzi whenever they left the property, whether they were going to the hospital or simply shopping for groceries. He did all of it in secret and said nothing to Adeline, because he knew that if she discovered the darkness from his past was reaching toward her because of him, if she believed Pazzi might be placed in danger because of her presence, then with her pride and fear, she would immediately pack their belongings and disappear into the night, throwing herself back into the very mire she had only just escaped. And that was something Rourke, for a reason he still didn't dare to name, absolutely refused to allow. What Rourke didn't know was that the greatest danger at that moment wasn't coming from Gareth Thorne on the other side of the city, but from the very man who had stood behind him all these years, the person he trusted most, his right-hand man, Silvio Marchetti. For months, a quiet resentment had been growing inside Silvio, because he had realized something Rourke believed he had concealed very carefully. His boss was gradually withdrawing from the underworld, quietly cutting away the criminal enterprises that had sustained the family for years, and trying to wash the blood from his hands so he could lead the Castellano family down a different path. To Rourke, it was a road toward redemption, but to Silvio, a man who had grown accustomed to living in the shadows and profiting from those very dealings. It was nothing less than a death sentence for all the power and wealth he had spent his life building. He couldn't accept watching the empire in which he had invested everything collapse simply because his boss had suddenly decided he wanted to become a decent man. And it was from that resentment that Silvio had secretly committed an unforgivable betrayal. He had joined forces with Gareth Thorne, the family's enemy, and agreed to help him from within in exchange for status and profit in the new order Thorne intended to create. And now, as he watched Rourke grow increasingly tender toward the housekeeper and her little sister, Silvio recognized the perfect opportunity to remove Adeline while planting suspicion, destroying the fragile feelings that had begun changing his boss. He remembered the night he had found Adeline standing outside the narrow opening of Rourke's office door, listening to a confidential conversation, and he knew he had all the material he needed to construct the perfect lie. One evening, Silvio approached Rourke wearing a grave expression, as though he were about to perform some painful duty, and in a low voice heavy with false loyalty, he began dripping poison into the ear of the man he had betrayed. "Boss," he said, "there's something I've struggled for a long time to decide whether I should tell you, but for the sake of your safety, I can't remain silent any longer." Then he told him. He claimed that he had caught Adeline lingering near Rourke's office several times late at night, that she appeared to be listening to private discussions, and worse still, he lowered his voice and said that he had ordered someone to follow her, and discovered that she had secretly been in contact with Thorne's men. To make his story appear more convincing, Silvio produced several pieces of evidence he had carefully fabricated, a note bearing handwriting that had been skillfully forged, and a blurred photograph taken from a distance showing a woman with a figure similar to Adeline's speaking to an unfamiliar man on a street corner. The evidence had been arranged so cleverly that even someone as perceptive as Rourke was forced to pause. "Think about it," Silvio continued, pouring more bitter sweetness into his deception. "A woman suddenly appears asleep in your room on the most sensitive night imaginable. It's a coincidence that seems far too perfect. And now Thorne somehow knows every detail of your movements. Don't you find that strange? Perhaps she was planted here from the beginning. Perhaps the entire pitiful story about her sick little sister was nothing more than a performance designed to earn your trust." The words pierced Rourke like needles, and although his reason still screamed that something was wrong, that the pride in Adeline's eyes when she refused his money couldn't possibly have been an act, that Posey's gap-toothed laughter couldn't possibly have been false, the seed of doubt Silvio had planted had already begun taking root inside his mind. In Rourke's world, trust was the most dangerous luxury of all, and he had survived until that day, precisely because he had always suspected everyone. He remembered the provocation in Thorne's letter. He remembered how the enemy seemed to know far too much about his private life. And for the first time since Adeline had entered his world, a cold question slipped into his heart. Was the woman he had begun to trust, the woman he had begun allowing close to him, truly the person she appeared to be? Adeline knew nothing about the poisonous words Silvio had poured into Rourke's ear, but she sensed the change immediately. The way the air around him suddenly turned cold again, as though the wall of ice she had believed was beginning to melt had risen once more, taller and thicker than before. The evenings when he returned home early, the moments when he happened to pause outside the library and watch her studying, the brief conversations he shared with Posse in the courtyard, all of it suddenly vanished without explanation. Now, whenever they crossed paths inside the mansion, Rourke merely gave her a slight nod before turning away, his eyes studying her in a way that sent a chill through her. It was no longer the gaze of the man who had knelt beside her sister and saved her, but the suspicious stare of someone trying to decide whether she was a friend or an enemy. Adeline couldn't understand what she had done wrong. She searched through her memories of every word she had spoken and every action she had taken over the past few days, wondering whether she had unknowingly crossed some boundary, whether she had done something to offend him, but she could find no answer. And that uncertainty hurt her even more than his coldness. She was far too familiar with being abandoned by life. But she had allowed herself to believe, even if only through the faintest glimmer of hope, that this place might be different, that this man might be different. At night, after Posse had fallen deeply asleep, Adeline sat beside the window and looked out over the darkened garden, and for the first time since moving there, the thought of leaving rose inside her again. Perhaps this was a sign, she thought. Perhaps she had been foolish to believe that someone like her could ever have a place in the world of someone like him. Perhaps it was time to pack their belongings and walk away before she became too deeply entangled, before her heart and Posey's were wounded even more severely. But then she looked toward the small bed where Posey slept, her face now peaceful and rosy, her breathing steady and free from the wheezing that had haunted so many nights before, and Adeline's heart tightened. The little girl had grown accustomed to this place, to the wide garden, the warm room, the excellent hospital only a few minutes away, and even to the tall man she innocently called uncle and told endless stories about everything under the sun. Leaving now would mean dragging Posy back into the misery of midnight journeys to the emergency room and medical bills they could never afford, and Adeline understood that she had no right to selfishly place her pride above the health of the sister she loved more than her own life. She sat there for a long time, torn between hurt and responsibility, between the instinct to run and the love that compelled her to remain, and she faced the question that had haunted her for so many years, the question life repeated again and again like a curse, whether someone like her would ever be allowed to trust another person after opening her heart so many times only to be met with betrayal and loss. After her father had been taken from her by an accident, after her mother had been taken by illness, after the world had taught her again and again that every support she leaned upon would eventually collapse, perhaps trust was simply a luxury that people like her would never have the right to touch, she thought, as tears silently traced their way down her cheeks. But what Adeline didn't know, as she sat there drowning in loneliness and private torment, was that at the very moment the distance between her and Rourke was widening to its most dangerous point, when a wall of suspicion had divided two people who should have been standing on the same side, the men setting their trap in the darkness had also realized that their opportunity had finally arrived, because prey that had been isolated, prey that no longer believed it had anyone's protection, was always the easiest prey to hunt, and Gareth Thorne and the traitor inside the house had been waiting patiently for this exact moment for a very long time. The opportunity Thorne had been waiting for came late one afternoon, when Adeline left the estate grounds alone to go to the pharmacy and purchase additional emergency medication for Posy. On a deserted street, a luxurious car quietly pulled up beside her, and the window lowered to reveal a face she had never seen before, yet somehow recognized immediately from the icy shiver that ran down her spine. The man inside the car wore a courteous smile, but his eyes were as cold as metal, and when he called her by name, then spoke Posy's name as well, Adeline knew that this was Gareth Thorne, the man who had haunted her sleepless nights for years. He invited her into the car with a politeness so unnerving that it made her skin crawl, saying he only wanted to have a brief conversation, that she had no reason to be afraid, and although every instinct inside Adeline urged her to run, she remained where she was, because she understood that fleeing from a man like Thorne would only make matters worse. He didn't waste much time. With the soft voice of a serpent, Thorne began laying out an offer carefully designed to strike the most vulnerable place in the mother's heart within her. He told her that he knew everything about her circumstances, that he knew about the enormous debt weighing upon her shoulders, knew about Possy's illness, and even knew about the nights when she carried the little girl into the emergency room. Then he told her that every one of those burdens could disappear with a single nod. "I'll erase your debt," he said, each word as sweet as honey. "I won't reduce it. I'll erase it completely, as though it never existed. And that's not all. I'll secure the little girl's future, the finest doctors, the best medicine, a decent school, and a life you've never even dared to dream you could give her." Adeline stood frozen, and when Thorne saw the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, he knew that his hook had begun to sink in. "In return," he said, lowering his voice, "I only need one small thing from you. You're living inside Rourke Castellano's home. You have access to places my men could never reach. You hear things that everyone in this city is desperate to know. All I need is for you to keep your eyes and ears open and bring me something, a piece of information, a document, anything that could help me bring that man down. Just once, and afterward, you and the little girl will be free forever." In that moment, standing in the fading light of the deserted street, Adeline felt as though the entire world were holding its breath, waiting for her answer, and the truth was that no offer had ever tempted her so deeply. Every argument in the world seemed to favor accepting it. The man Thorne wanted her to betray had only recently turned his back on her without explanation, treating her with cold indifference and looking at her with suspicion as though she were a liar. What did she still owe him? What bond of gratitude remained that could demand her loyalty? And on the other side of the scale was Posy, the precious little sister Adeline had sworn to protect with her own life, the one and perhaps final chance to give the child a future free from the darkness of illness and poverty. All it would take was one nod, and every night she had spent awake with worry, every tear she had swallowed in silence, would finally come to an end. Adeline's hand tightened inside her coat pocket, where she always carried Posey's photograph, and she felt her heart being torn in two. One half screamed at her to think of the little girl, to seize this opportunity, while the other half whispered something small but unyielding, a voice that sounded like her late mother, the woman who had taught her that no matter how poor they were, they still had to live with decency and keep their heads held high. Thorne watched the conflict moving across her face with the patience of a hunter long accustomed to the moment when his prey hesitated, and he smiled faintly, certain that no mother in the world could refuse the price he had just offered. Gareth Thorne had made a mistake, the kind of mistake often made by men who measured everything in money and fear. He had believed that when a mother was driven into a corner, she would do anything, forgetting that some people, even after life had stripped everything away from them, still held on to something no amount of money could ever buy, their own conscience. Adeline lifted her head, and when she spoke, her voice no longer trembled. It had become strangely calm, the calm of someone who had passed through a violent storm within herself and finally found solid ground again. "You're right about one thing," she said. "I don't owe Rourke Castellano anything, and perhaps he does suspect me and has treated me coldly. I won't deny that. But you're mistaken if you think I'll trade away the person I am for the freedom you've painted before me. My mother raised me on the meager wages of a nurse. She left me no inheritance except one lesson, that no matter how poor we become, no matter if the entire world turns its back on us, we must never sell our conscience, because once it has been sold, not even an entire fortune can buy it back. If I accept your offer, if I betray a man who gave my sister a home and saved her when she was in danger, then even if Posey were to live surrounded by luxury, I'd no longer have the right to teach her to live with decency. And a child raised beside a sister who has lost her soul wouldn't truly have a future worth calling a future." "I refuse," she said, firmly and clearly. "Keep your money and never come near me again." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Gareth Thorne sitting motionless inside the car, the smile frozen on his lips. For the first time in his life, he tasted defeat at the hands of the very prey he had believed was already trapped securely within his grasp. But Adeline didn't stop with merely refusing him. Throughout the journey back to the estate, her mind spun with the pieces of truth Thorne's offer had unintentionally revealed, because he had said that he knew every movement inside Rourke's house, knew where she went, what she heard, and that could only mean someone inside was feeding him information, someone close enough to watch even her. And as she traced the events backward through her memory, she suddenly shuddered at the recollection of the cold eyes that had stared at her from the far end of the dark hallway on the night she had accidentally paused beside the narrow opening of Rourke's office door, the eyes of Silvio, the man who had wanted to deal with her from the very first night. Everything suddenly became clear in her mind like a flash of lightning. Rourke's abrupt coldness, the suspicion in the way he looked at her, all of it must have begun with the lies that Traitor had poured into his ears. The moment she returned, Adeline did something that neither her wounded pride nor her fear could prevent. She went directly to Rourke, faced the man who had coldly turned his back on her, and told him everything, about her encounter with Thorne, about the offer he had made, about her refusal, and about her suspicion that there was a traitor inside the house. Rourke listened, and every word she spoke struck like a hammer against the wall of doubt Silvio had so carefully built inside him. Because if Adeline truly had been Thorne's spy, as Silvio had accused her of being, she would never have been foolish enough to reject such a profitable offer, and she certainly wouldn't have come directly to expose the conspiracy and warn Rourke about the traitor within his own home. The truth stood before him, naked and bitter. The woman he had wrongly suspected, treated coldly, and pushed away was the most honest person among them, while the man he trusted above all others, the right-hand man into whose hands he had placed his very life, was the true venomous snake coiled inside his own house. A terrifying silence settled over Rourke after Adeline left the room, the silence of a man who had just seen the entire chessboard revealed clearly before his eyes. He didn't fly into a rage, he didn't smash anything or shout, because the most dangerous men were always the calmest when they struck. He understood that if he rushed blindly into violent revenge, he would fall directly into the trap his enemies had laid for him and drive his family into the bloody war that Thorne and Silvio had been hoping to provoke. So he chose another path, the path of intelligence, strategy, and power exercised with cold and precise control. Over the days that followed, Rourke quietly began weaving his net. He gave Silvio no indication that he had seen through him. He continued treating him as he always had and assigning him the same familiar duties, but every step Silvio took was now being closely watched by the most loyal men Rourke could discreetly summon. He allowed Silvio to continue his performance of betrayal, allowed him to keep contacting Thorne, and through those communications, Rourke slowly gathered every piece of evidence he needed, recording each meeting, every agreement, and every trace showing how the two men had joined forces to undermine the family and threaten an innocent woman. Then, when every piece was finally in position, Rourke made his move, and he didn't strike with guns or bullets, but with a weapon far sharper. He used the vast network of influence the Castellano family had built over generations, connections reaching into every circle, people who owed him favors, and doors that opened only at the sound of his name. One by one, Thorne's business arrangements suddenly collapsed. The people who had once protected him turned their backs. His investments vanished after only a few telephone calls, and the empire Thorne believed he was building to overpower the Castellanos proved to be nothing more than a castle of sand before the true strength of the man he had dared to challenge. The final confrontation between them didn't take place in a gunfight, but inside a silent room, where Rourke placed before Thorne every piece of evidence concerning Silvio's betrayal and Thorne's illicit dealings. In a calm, low voice, more frightening than any shouted threat, Rourke told him that he had lost everything, and that if he ever dared to approach Adeline or Pazzi again, whatever he still possessed in this world would disappear like smoke. Thorne, a man accustomed to terrorizing the weak, sat there with his face drained of color beneath Rourke's gaze, and for the first time, he understood the difference between someone who merely knew how to make threats and someone who truly held power in his hands. As for Silvio, the moment his betrayal was exposed was also the moment he lost everything: his position, his influence, and the very place for which he had sold his soul. Rourke allowed him to leave, carrying the humiliation of a traitor drowned by his own greed, a punishment more bitter than any act of vengeance. But that victory didn't come without a price, because to drive Thorne completely into a corner, Rourke had been forced to sacrifice a considerable part of his own empire. He surrendered profits he could have preserved and accepted heavy losses in exchange for the absolute safety of the two people who had become more important to him than he dared admit. Only after Gareth Thorne had been completely stripped of his power, when his name no longer carried enough influence to frighten anyone, could Rourke finally do what he had been unable to do from the beginning. He freed Adeline from the debt weighing upon her shoulders, not by secretly paying money to a man who still held the power to control her fate, but by openly and lawfully reclaiming the entire debt through legal procedures and erasing it permanently and irrevocably, ensuring that no ghost from her past would ever return to haunt her again. On the night when every danger had finally receded, Rourke went to the small house on the estate grounds, where Adeline was sitting beside the window after Pazzi had fallen deeply asleep. For the first time since she had moved there, he knocked on the door like a guest rather than an employer, then asked her permission to sit down and speak with her for a while. Adeline looked at him, the wounds from those days of cold indifference still fresh inside her, and she couldn't conceal the caution in her eyes. Yet there was something different about the man standing before her that night. The icy shell of a powerful boss was gone, and beneath it stood a human being whose cracks had finally begun to reveal what lay inside. He began with an apology, something he had perhaps never offered anyone in his entire life. He apologized for doubting her, for allowing lies to poison his trust, for treating her coldly and causing her pain when she had done nothing wrong. Then he began to tell her his story, slowly, as though every word required all the courage he possessed before it could leave his lips. He told her that long before she entered his life, he had already begun searching for a way out of the dark world into which he had been born and raised. He had grown sick of the cold-blooded violence and endless calculation, and he had longed for another kind of life, one in which he wouldn't have to sleep with a gun beside his pillow or suspect everyone who came near him. But leaving the darkness was never easy, he said. Old obligations held him back, certain dealings couldn't be severed overnight, and men like Silvio and Thorne were always trying to drag him back into the mire because their own lives depended upon it. He had been trapped between the man he once was and the man he wanted to become, and during those years of inner conflict, he had nearly lost all faith that someone like him could still be redeemed. Then he paused, and when he continued, his voice dropped lower, carrying a pain he had buried for many years. He told her about the loss from his past, about the loved one he had brought to the hospital too late, about the night he had sat helplessly in the corridor, while all the money and limited power he possessed at the time proved meaningless before the hand of death. And he told her about the nurse who had remained beside the bed even after her shift had ended, the gentle woman who had held the dying person's hand and whispered words of comfort, caring for Rourke's loved one with such devotion that it was as though she were tending to a member of her own family. Adeline listened, and as he reached that part of the story, she began to feel something rising painfully in her chest, a faint realization she didn't yet dare believe. He looked directly into her eyes and revealed the truth he had kept hidden for so long. The compassionate nurse from that night, the woman whose kindness he had carried as an unpaid debt through all the years that followed, had been Adeline's mother. The entire room seemed to fall silent, and tears quietly spilled down Adeline's face as she understood that her late mother, even after leaving this world, was still watching over her and protecting her in a way she could never have imagined. Rourke told her that on the night he found her asleep on the bathroom floor, he had helped her without understanding why, driven only by a strange pull deep within him, and that it was only much later that he discovered the thread of fate that had connected their two families across the years. Then he told her something else that made her heart tremble. She and Posy weren't the reason he wanted to change, because he had longed to change before he ever met them. Instead, she and the little girl were living proof that he had been right to choose that path, a reminder that beyond all the darkness, there was still a light worth fighting to reach. And in that moment, within the small room filled with moonlight, the final wall of ice between two people who belonged to worlds separated by an immense distance quietly melted away, making room for a gentle understanding neither of them had ever dared to dream of. From the night that wall of ice finally melted, something gentle began to bloom within Rourke's once cold and silent home, and Posy, with the pure sensitivity that belongs only to a child, was the first to sense the change. She no longer hesitated whenever she saw him. Instead, she ran out to greet him each time he returned, telling him endless stories about school, proudly showing him her newest drawings, and Rourke, the man who had once made countless others tremble in fear, now sat patiently listening to every small and ordinary tale of an 8-year-old child with a tenderness he had never known he possessed. One afternoon, while the two of them were sitting together on the familiar front steps, Posy suddenly lifted her clear, innocent eyes toward him and asked a question that made his heart stop for a moment. "Uncle Rourke," she said in a voice that was innocent yet deeply sincere, "you'll stay here with Addie and me forever, won't you? You won't ever go away, will you?" Rourke looked down at the small face turned upward as she waited for his answer, her shining eyes filled with a simple yet desperate longing, the wish that just one grown person would remain, that one source of safety wouldn't disappear, and he felt something rise painfully in his chest. Throughout his entire life, Rourke had never made a promise unless he was certain he could keep it, because in his world, an empty promise could cost someone their life, and so he had learned never to speak words he couldn't guarantee. But this time was different. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself down to the little girl's level, so that his eyes met hers directly, and he spoke in a voice that was warm, deep, and unwavering, every word coming from the deepest place within his heart. "I promise," he said. "I'll stay here with you and Addie. I'm not going anywhere." Posy beamed, her familiar gap-toothed smile lighting up her entire face, then held out her tiny little finger toward him. "Pinky promise," she said. "Once we link fingers, you have to keep your word." Rourke looked at the tiny finger extended before him, and the man who had signed agreements that determined the fate of entire fortunes, who had shaken hands with the most powerful men in the city, gently extended his own large little finger and hooked it around hers, sealing the most sacred agreement he had ever made in his life. Standing silently in the doorway, Adeline witnessed the entire moment, and she had to raise a hand to cover her mouth to hold back a sob, because she understood that the promise he had just made wasn't something an adult had said merely to comfort a child. It was a vow this man would keep with his entire life. But Rourke didn't stop at caring for Posy. He had quietly remembered Adeline's unfinished dream, the dream he had glimpsed on those nights when she sat bent over her old medical textbook, and he understood that the most meaningful gift he could offer her wasn't money, because he knew too well that her pride would reject anything resembling charity. Instead, he gave her what she needed most, time and faith. He rearranged the household duties so that she would have free days of her own, researched programs that would allow her to complete the final year of nursing school she had been forced to abandon, and placed all that information before her not as an order or a favor, but as an open door, leaving the decision of whether to walk through it entirely in her hands. "You gave up your dream to save Posy," he told her gently. And that was one of the noblest things any person could ever do. But it doesn't mean you have to bury that dream forever. Now you have time, you have someone to support you, and if you want to continue down the path your mother once walked, I'll be here to take care of Posy whenever you need to study. Adeline looked at him through eyes blurred with tears, because for the first time in all those long years, someone didn't pity her or offer her charity. He simply believed that she deserved to dream again. 6 months had passed since the day Posy's tiny little finger hooked around Rourke's promise, and life within the estate had changed in ways none of them had ever dared to imagine, though not in the manner of a fairy tale where every wound healed overnight. They still weren't a perfect family, and perhaps they never would be, at least not in the flawless sense people so often dreamed of. Rourke was still a man carrying the crushing weight of his past. There were still nights when he remained awake with the old ghosts haunting him, and there was still a long road ahead before he could completely free himself from the world into which he had been born. He knew that road would never be easy. Adeline was still the same cautious woman, still holding a measure of wariness inside her heart after life had wounded her too many times, still unable to fully allow herself to believe that this happiness was real and would remain, because a heart that had been shattered so often couldn't heal after only a few peaceful months. Yet amid everything that remained unfinished, one thing had truly changed. They were here, together, and they were trying every day. Adeline had returned to school. She had studied tirelessly after the hours she spent caring for Posy, and only the week before, she had passed the first examination on her journey toward completing the nursing dream she had once been forced to abandon, the examination she had believed she would never have the chance to take in this lifetime. As she held the results in her hands with tears shimmering in her eyes, she understood that this was only the first step, that many lessons, many examinations, and many long nights of study still lay ahead. But for the first time in years, the road before her no longer resembled a wall of despair. It had become a door slowly opening. That afternoon, as the final golden rays of sunlight stretched across the green lawns of the estate, Rourke and Adeline stood beside each other on the porch. They didn't say much. They simply allowed themselves to enjoy the rare moment of peace that both of them had paid far too dearly to possess. Then, from the far end of the garden, Posy came running toward them, her hair streaming in the wind, her radiant face no longer bearing any trace of the asthma attacks that had once tormented her, her laughter ringing out as she called both their names. The little girl rushed between them and wrapped her small arms around Addie and Uncle Rourke at the same time, pulling them together in one warm embrace. And in that simple moment, surrounded by the clear laughter of a child and the gentle light of sunset, 3 people whom fate had wounded in different ways suddenly realized that they had found one another, that they had become something new and fragile, yet undeniably real. They weren't completely healed. The scars of the past were still there and would always remain, but they had changed. Together, they had stepped out of the darkness and begun moving toward the light, and perhaps that alone was enough. If the story of Adeline, Rourke, and little Posy touched something within your heart, we would truly love to hear how it made you feel, because every comment you leave is a story, a heartfelt connection, and an expression of compassion that we cherish deeply. What do you think about Adeline's decision to reject such a tempting offer in order to preserve her conscience? And if you were in her place, would you have the courage to do the same? Please share the thoughts from the deepest part of your heart in the comments below so that we may listen to one another. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to press the like button, share the video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that every day you can hear more meaningful stories that touch the human heart. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story until its final moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, lasting joy, and peace throughout every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in our next videos.